Right. I'll just check first. Can you hear me at the back?
Yep.
Okay. Yes? Right. Yes. Robbie mentioned the book. It's historical in itself now. It's called On the Knife Edge, the inside story of the Sheffield cutlery industry. But this was written 20 odd years ago, and most of the people in here are dead. But what we did was that we did capture their stories, their voices, on tape, in photographs, and then put them into the book, because these were the last, well, I mean, I'd say the last of their breed, the last cutthroat razor grinder, the last acid etcher in Sheffield. You know, so this was actually extremely rewarding, making this doing the book and making a radio programme. And is anybody here a member of the British Cutlery and Silverware Association? Because I was saying earlier that I'm a journalist, I'm a broadcaster, I'm an oral historian. I'm not in PR. And the worst job that I've ever had, I should say the most challenging job perhaps, was as part-time PR for the British Cutlery and Silverware Association 25 years ago, or 20 odd years ago. Because these were a group of companies and individuals, but mainly companies, most of which no longer exist. And part of the reason they no longer exist, they didn't want publicity, or they didn't want everybody else to know what they were doing. And it was the devil's own job to work in PR for people who didn't want publicity. And I think I have a slide a bit later on actually which demonstrates this. I lasted for about 3 years. It was part-time. I lasted for about 3 years. And we actually parted company because I wrote this book and I did a radio programme for Radio 4 called On the Knife Edge, which was looking at the, sort of the state at the time of the cutlery industry, but also talking to some great craftspeople like Stan Shaw, who some of you will know, the penknife maker here in Sheffield. Because how many of you are from Sheffield? Okay, so some from Sheffield and then obviously some from much further afield?
Yeah.
Yes, from North Yorkshire, Gloucestershire?
Bromley.
Sorry, where?
Bromley.
Oh, right, okay. So I won't make this too Sheffield based. But I would say, as a result of working with it, the best thing that came out of working with the BCSA was that I threw out all my Korean cutlery and replaced it with Sheffield made. And I was still only buy Sheffield made cutlery, or indeed, knives from David Mellor or whoever. I also have some very neat cutthroat razors at home, which I was going to bring in, but as I can't remember where I put them because I was so frightened of them, I went So, what do journalists want? I mean, I'm going to repeat some of what has already been said by Andy, that we want an interesting story that is relevant to whoever our audience is. A pitch doesn't need to be a press release, it can be an email, but we want it to contain all the relevant facts. There's a good read, again, what Andy was saying, we don't want reams. Not too long. Sent in good time, and either photos to accompany it, or some reference on the press release or the email that there are photographs, or that it will make a good photograph, because I mean, newspapers do have photographers, although the picture editor I used to work with on the Sheffield Star just died this week, but they do still have both photographers. So, what do we mean by a good story? Right, this brings me back to the BCSA, the British Cutlery and Silverware Association. This was when I knew that this was a relationship that really wasn't going to work. Because there was a company here in Sheffield that was making things like, and I call them baby camel dishes. I'm not quite sure how small baby camel is, but they were making them for the Sultan of Brunei. And I did a press release, a very nice press release about this, and they were horrified, and they didn't want it sent out, because they didn't want other people in Sheffield, with other manufacturers, their rivals, to know what they were making. That's very frustrating when you are a journalist or working in PR, you know, because it's a good story. Or maybe you're making costumes for Downton Abbey. Another good story. You know it's coming up, you see the costumes, we want to know about it. Or maybe you're about to move premises. Or, and is Stuart Mitchell here?
Not yet.
No, he's not. Because this is the Portland Works in Sheffield, which I think it's 4 craftspeople there still, and it's been threatened with being turned into apartments. And is anybody here who's affected by that? Because I believe that, you know, that means that they will lose their workshops. I mean, this also happened not that far from here at Butcher's Works, which some of you will know. And when I was doing the on the Knife Edge book, I went into Butcher's Works and interviewed people in there about work they were doing, like a scissor borer and hardener called Ron Birch, who had a sign that said "Home Sweat Home" in his workshop. And obviously, they had to move out when Butcher's Works was being turned into apartments, as we now call them. But actually, I think what's happened there is fabulous, because you've got apartments, a wonderful organic cafe, you've got craftspeople, and they're working with, some of them are working with apprentices from Freeman College, and you've got a gallery and you've got a shop attached. So it's become a very valuable resource, I think, for Sheffield, unlike some of the other buildings here in Sheffield, the cutlery and silver making and so on buildings, which have just been neglected. But I won't go too far down that road. I just don't understand why Sheffield can't have a cutlery trail, cutlery silverware trail, like Birmingham has its jewellery trail. Maybe somebody would like to take that away. Again, maybe you're taking on your first apprentice. These are all potential stories. And I put in it, you know, the word just. This is not old news. You haven't suddenly remembered 2 months later, oh my goodness, I made one of those petals for the Olympic, you know, for the Olympic flower of that opening ceremony. We want to know in advance of this. I mentioned apprentices. I made a series for Radio 4 a few years ago called Apprentice to the Past, which was about some of the threatened crafts and trades, and it was like flint knapping, pargeting. And again, what Andy says, you know, it's really interesting. I'm really interested. I was fascinated to go and see what a pargeter did. I didn't even know what pargeting was until, you know, I stumbled across it. And flint knapping. And these made quarter-hour programs. Now, okay, they didn't come to me for publicity. I developed the idea, and I can't for the life of me remember where the idea came from now, but I know that I was helped a lot by another organisation in the crafts industry now. Again, I can't quite remember what that's called. But they were extremely helpful in telling me the range of crafts that were available, and then it was up to me to choose which ones we featured, because we only had 5 programs. So what we were looking for, what I was looking for, was people who were willing, helpful, talkative, could explain what they were doing, could explain flint knapping to me. And this is an example just from last week's Sheffield Telegraph, which I think is a very good example of how you can use the press. I don't know if anybody saw this story. Oh, Andy mentioned photographs, and I don't actually know who took this photograph, and whether this was a Sheffield Telegraph photographer, or whether it was sent in by Ernest Wright & Co. Does anybody here know Ernest? Sorry?
It was paper.
It was the paper that did it, right. I mean, because I'm kind of in two minds about it. I think it's a really, I think think it's a really striking picture. It's an excellent picture. At the same time, it's something a little bit alarming about it, isn't it?
They regretted that the photo doesn't show the shop.
Oh, was the shop behind?
Well, the shop is the story.
Yes, yeah. Yes, because yes, that's right.
And it does look nice.
Yes, I think I might have a slide on here of this, of the shop. But anyway, this appeared in the Sheffield Telegraph. And I'll tell you the story behind the story in a minute. But this is what Leslie Draper, who was the writer, this is how she wrote her story. One of Sheffield's oldest companies has celebrated its 110th anniversary by opening its first ever shop and visitor centre. And this is Nick Wright. Ernest Wright and Son, established in 1902, was once among more than 60 scissor manufacturers within a square mile of central Sheffield. Now it's the only one. Managing Director Nick Wright, great-grandson of the founder, has set up a new centre to preserve part of the city's steel heritage. It opened on Tuesday at the company's new home, Endeavour Works, in Broad Lane. I should say as well, I've actually tried to interest Radio 4 in the idea of Ernest Wright's. I have yet to persuade them, but I love that idea, or I shouldn't say I love the idea, but I'm very interested in the idea of the last of the breed. And I think that there is very much a story here, but sometimes it can be extremely difficult trying to persuade organisations like Radio 4. And I know I recently had a programme on Radio 3 which was 5 years in the attempt to sell it. I kept changing its title, I kept slightly kind of rearranging it. It was eventually called, it eventually went back to the very original title, which was Cow Dust Time, which is the time of day in India when the cows are coming home from the field, and it's a very magical time of day, and the dust is going up from their hooves. And there's a lot of it's got very religious significance, it's a very auspicious time, it's got historical significance. It's a fascinating story, and I had started 5 years ago by trying to sell this idea of Cow Dust Time to Radio 4, they didn't want it. I changed the title to when the cows come home, hoping that they wouldn't realise it was the same idea. They did, still didn't want it. I did the same thing with Radio 3. I eventually called it, and this was the real clincher. I changed the title completely to When the Earth Does Yoga. And Radio 3 took it, and then about 2 months later I said, actually, could we change the title to Cow Dust Time? And they said, yeah, fine. This is what we have to deal with too, it's not just you. But you know, if you find a journalist who's interested in what you do, and that journalist gets passionate about it too, they will try to sell it. It may not be to the first buyer, but they will carry on trying. And I'm still going to carry on trying with Ernest Wright's, because I did another programme another few years back called Nerves of Steel, and it was about specialist steels here in Sheffield. I tried to sell that idea for at least two years, giving it different titles. The title was actually given to me by a student, because I was going to call it The Story of the Hip Joint, which I also thought was a very nice idea, because it was, you know, the idea that so many people, that hip joints are made of Sheffield steel, specialist steel, that the Queen Mother walked with the help of Sheffield steel. And they didn't, again, trying to persuade Radio 4, it's the devil's own job. And so I called it The Story of the Hip Joint, and they turned it down. And I was telling this story to some students, and I said, so, you know, come on, give me another title for it then. And one of them immediately said, Nerves of Steel. And that's what it went out under. So it was about that steel industry here, it was about joint replacements and how people can walk with this steel, the whole process, but it was also about things like scalpels and how they're made here by Swan Morton. Though I did eventually, when the programme was almost, well, I thought it was ready to go, and then we had compliance editors at Radio 4, and they came back to me, and that was the first time they'd ever done this, and they said, "You mentioned Swan Morton half a dozen times in the last 5 minutes of this programme. You will have to take some of those mentions out." And of course they were quite right, I just hadn't noticed. But we do have to be very careful on radio or with the BBC that we're not seem to be just totally promoting organisations. So, going back to this story, all the relevant facts, this idea, do we have all the relevant facts? And Andy mentioned who, what, why, when, where, and how. And those are questions, those are standard journalistic questions that we want answered in the story, and therefore, if at all possible, in whatever publicity you send to us, we want to know who. And there's 3 answers to that in this story. What? Where? And that, I think, is the new building. When? Why? And how? Well, that explains the later, but it can part of the later part of the story. But those 5 W's are all answered in the first 3 paragraphs of that story. And that's what we would be looking for as well, if at all possible. I mean, you're not journalists, we accept that. But in your press release or your email, we want to know who, what, why, when, and where. Because then we can look at that email, we can look at that press release, and you're halfway to doing the story for us. And we like people to make our lives easier. So, just to reiterate, we want an interesting story, and again, as Andy said, newsworthy as well. But again, if you think it's an interesting story, run it past us. Don't think, oh, it's not newsworthy. Let us be the deciders for that. I mean, my husband's a travel writer, and he will sometimes say to me, I'll say, well, why don't you do a piece on such and such a place? Oh, why don't you do a piece on Hathersage? Well, they won't want it because, and he starts telling me why they won't want it. And I always say, just ask them and let them decide what they want. Don't self-sabotage. So we want to know, we want to be able to see quite easily in your communication what the story is. Don't forget to put contact details on. Obviously, if you've got an email address, then we know your email address. But it can be very frustrating, to get something like a press release, or sometimes you see these posters up for advertising an event somewhere, and the one thing they've missed out is either when it's happening, usually when actually, is what they miss out. So just include the relevant details, tell us who you are, how we get hold of you. Again, reiterating what Andy said, not too long, try and keep it punchy, relevant. I'm going to come back a bit to deadlines, but journalists, especially on newspapers, work to tight deadlines. In radio, well, if I'm doing something for Woman's Hour, then Woman's Hour is obviously working to very tight deadlines. But the Salford edition of Woman's Hour they have a weekly programme in the Woman's Hour mix. So they have longer deadlines to think about. In terms of making longer programmes for Radio 4, that can be as long as a piece of string. They work so far ahead. But if you're wanting to get something on a programme like you and yours, Woman's Hour, then I think with all of this, it's a case of thinking ahead and, again, reiterating what's been said already, regarding publicity as part of your work. It's not something over there that's irrelevant. It's actually about getting your message across. So you need to think, how far in advance, do people need to know? And really, it's as soon as you know something, start telling the media about it. As soon as you know something and you're happy, for the media to know. I mean, obviously, if you're hoping for a contract and you haven't got it, that's too early. But the minute you get that contract, or the minute you start working on the pedal for the Olympic plane, start thinking in terms of media coverage. And the efficient and helpful response. We've all had experience, well, journalists and PR all had experience of trying to get blood out of a stone. And you stop, you just think, okay, I'll find somebody else, who can tell me this story. I mean, Andy told the story about company A, company B. But this can also happen with individual craftspeople. If one person is kind of saying, oh no, I don't want to tell you, oh no, I can't possibly. Well, this did just happen just recently. I was making a programme on Radio 3, and it was just unfortunate, really. It was called Houses That Fall Into the Sea. It was about east coast of Yorkshire erosion. But it was taking 3 different people's stories, or 4, because there was a couple. There was an artist who actually bought a house at a particular stage, just outside Scarborough, in order to turn it into what he called a site-specific installation, an artwork. To the people next door, it was their home. There was a third person involved who was a writer and who was also, I was interviewing. The artist is very publicity savvy. His name is Kane Cunningham. If you look him up online, you'll find out all about the house project. I think his problem at the moment, and he recognises this, is that the house isn't actually falling over the cliff. So Ron and Judith Backhouse, who live next to him, or very close to him, they are devastated that their house is threatened by going over the cliff. Kane wants the house to go over the cliff, because this is his site-specific installation, his art piece. He'll probably sort of push it, I suspect. But he got publicity for this. He was in the programme because he was extremely kind of accessible, media savvy. There was somebody else who was a sculptor who I discovered a place called Skipsea, which is, again, falling over the cliff. And it was just unfortunate as a result of quite a slow response from her when I emailed her, and I think I had the wrong number, telephone number, but she eventually got back in touch with me after the programme had been broadcast. And it was a pity, because actually I thought that her story was also a fascinating story. But there comes a cut-off point when you think, no, I'll go with these people who were actually wonderful, the people I did speak to. So again, it's about being efficient, coming back to people as quickly as you possibly can. And good, willing talkers, and that's especially true in radio, of course. It's fairly hopeless in radio if somebody doesn't speak very well. Because you can't see them, all you can do is hear them. So what we don't want, ramble, or a story an email where the story is hidden right down here somewhere, although heavens God, you'll read stories in newspapers where the story is hidden right down here somewhere. We don't want something that doesn't include all the salient facts. We don't want old news, reluctant interviewees, and a story that has no relevance. And again, this is just something that you do need to think about, both the newspapers and magazines in particular, I think. They're not. There's no point. I might give an example. I can't, of course. But there's no point targeting, I don't know, Woman's Weekly magazine with a story about, and this has nothing to do with craft, obviously, but, you know, with a story about 20-year-old clubbing or binge drinking or 20-year-olds. I mean, I suppose that's not altogether true. The point would be that they would be the parents, the readers of Woman's Weekly will be the parents of the people, you know, who are maybe binge drinking. But again, it's just, who is this relevant to? And I know I interviewed the editor of Woman's Weekly magazine, because another programme I made earlier this year, which was about Women's Weekly, called Famed for its Knitting. You know, and she said it's very aggravating if they get press releases that are obviously not suitable, that have just been sent out willy-nilly, with no thought of why would Women's Weekly want to do anything about this. So, you know, it's just common sense, really. So again, you'll probably be learning more about this afternoon as well. But it's about, I mean, somebody asked earlier on about, you know, drawing a database of newspapers, magazines. Very good idea. So think about, make a note of who your local newspapers are. And whether they're daily or weekly, because then their lead-in times, their deadlines will be different. Regional ones as well, the Yorkshire Post, which is an extremely good regional newspaper. It has various supplements in it, and it has a Saturday magazine where quite a lot of the kind of work that you're doing could well feature in the magazine at a weekend. And I say that because my husband also writes for that section as well, and has done quite a few articles about local craftspeople or artists. Also think about a section that's most likely to take a story, and it might be more than one section, in which case you can just re-angle your story, you know, or your email, your press release, to those different sections. So it could be business, but then again, it could be in the life and style section, you know, with a bit of tweaking. And I think it's not just a case of writing Dear Business Editor, it's actually finding out the name of the business editor. It's not saying Dear Features Editor, it's saying, you know, Dear Joe Davison, say, from the Sheffield Star. We want that personal approach. I mean, at Pennine, we sometimes get emails that are obviously, you know, usually from young people who are wanting some work experience, and you can tell that they've been sent to all the different independent radio companies, because it'll just say, you know, Dear Sir or Madam, or something like that, and you think, this is going to everybody. You know, we've got a website, it has our names on it. All you needed to do was just say, Dear Clare, or Dear Clare Jenkins. Obviously, all newspapers have different deadlines. I'm venturing into slightly hazy territory here now, because of course the Sheffield Star used to be an evening newspaper, and now it comes out in the morning. So the lead-in times have changed. You know, if you want to get into the next day's paper, I actually don't know when you need to get hold of them. But again, you can ring up and ask. But something like the Sheffield Telegraph, which that story that Ernest Wright was in, and presumably was in the Sheffield Star as well. But in the Sheffield Telegraph, you'll notice that story that Ernest Wright referred to on Tuesday. So, you know, it had happened, but it was still in time for that, because the Sheffield Telegraph comes out on Thursday, so it was still in time for that week's newspaper. Again, covering some of the area that's already been covered, but again, press release and covering note and email. I'll go on to Leslie. Leslie Draper wrote the story that was in the Sheffield Telegraph about Ernest Wright. Ernest Wright's son. And okay, so actually what she said, I emailed her to ask her about this. She says, I actually met Nick Wright at a Galvanise event and we got talking. He's so enthusiastic about what he's doing, at that time on an unpaid basis. So I volunteered to do the first story for him, just to get him some publicity. So we're talking about enthusiasm here. He sent me a beautiful pair of scissors. Now, you see this? We were talking about sort of gifts earlier on. I think if you're sending something to somebody as a thank you, I think that's one thing. If you're giving it in advance, that's right. So he sent me a beautiful pair of scissors and demanded the traditional penny in exchange. So my husband and I went down to the factory to hand it over and he gave us a tour of the works. I told him to keep me in touch with developments, so he emailed me to let me know about The Apprentice, which is another story, and The Move. I'd say it's a good illustration of the fact that building up a relationship with the journalist is the key to good publicity. A press release is a good starting point, with a covering note, but I would prefer to have a chat to uncover the story that way. On the other hand, my colleague Jo Davison from the Sheffield Star liked to have everything laid out in a press release, so I guess it depends on the individual journalist. One other thing worth pointing out is that these days we don't have the luxury of being able to get out of the office much. So if a craftsperson has a story, it's probably a good idea for them to volunteer to call into the office. You can't beat a face-to-face meeting to impress your case on the journalist. And it is, I mean, it's about having a relationship with somebody, isn't it? You know, and they're not just this disembodied voice or this disembodied email person. They're there, you know, you take some of your work in, you show it to them, you're building up a relationship. And don't forget, you know, I mean, when we talk about who's doing who the favour, it's of mutual benefit. Journalists have got space to fill in droves. You know, radio journalists have got all that airspace that needs filling. You're helping us with our job, and especially if somebody's freelance as well, I think, because as freelancers, we look for work too. You give us a story, it gives us a commission, we get paid, you get publicity. And of course, with something like this is free publicity. I don't think there is, apart from a pair of scissors. Time magazines. Okay. So there's a story behind this story, which is I was going to a special event. I wanted a hat. I'm not big hat, mother of bride type. Couldn't find one. Someone said, why don't you try milliner? So I keyed in, I googled milliner plus Sheffield, and I came up with Imogen's Imagination. And she has a Facebook site. She's here in Sheffield. She lives in Main Bridge. She has a Facebook site. It was just a hat I wanted. I could see it on the Facebook site, and I subsequently bought a beautiful little hat from her as well, a little round, little like fascinating type hat. She's got a little papier-mâché lilac bird on it. I have never worn it, apart from once when I went in to give a seminar at Hallam University, just to show it off. But it's gorgeous. And I've actually volunteered, although I haven't got around to it yet, to write a press release for her, because I think her works are lovely. But actually, Sophie doesn't need, that's her name, she doesn't need me in a way, because she's got loads of examples, she's got loads of publicity. I mean, this is a kind of made-up story that I'm just thinking, okay, I kind of made this up very quickly. But, you know, if you were doing a press release, you might say something like this. By day, Sophie Cook analyses patterns of criminal behaviour across South Yorkshire. But by night, she works on different patterns, perhaps worn at everything from burlesque events to Buckingham Palace, which is where I was going. Sophie, a criminal intelligence analyst for South Yorkshire believes is also a skillful milliner. After finishing her day job, she returns to her home to design and make headwear for women going out to weddings and so on and so forth. And it gives the title and the name of her company in here as well. You know, and that's really interesting. You know, it's so interesting. She's got loads of publicity, and she's done it all herself, as well as having a day job. She's been referred to in Vogue, in the Sheffield Star, in other, you know, quite a number of other magazines as well. And she's delightful. I don't know if anybody's come across her much of this imagination, but look her up on that Facebook site. So again, the same things apply to magazines as to newspapers. You know, it's thinking about the market, your own trade magazines, but also the more general ones, as in Sophie's case, you know, something like Vogue, or in your case, you know, Best British Magazine, whatever. Again, writing to individual people, that's what the editor of a Woman's Weekly said, that she won't look at an email if it just says, "Dear Editor," because she said it's online, it's all there, online. What the name of the editor, the name of the features editor, the name of the fashion editor, there's no excuse for not addressing somebody directly, even if you haven't met them. And obviously for weekly magazines, you are talking, I think, at least 6 weeks ahead. Is that, you said the same? And for monthlies, 3 months ahead? 2 months ahead for monthly magazines. But I mean, like Christmas magazines, you know, if you were wanting to get something in a magazine, a monthly magazine for Christmas, you've missed it, haven't you? Because they start, so, you know, it's like all those Christmas cards that appear in the charity shops at the beginning of August. So, really, as soon as you know you've got something to tell. And as far as radio is concerned, some of you will, if you're from Sheffield, will know that's Roland Robinson from Radio Sheffield. Again, it's about telling us in advance. No point telling us the day before something's happened. Somebody's sort of waking up thinking, oh, I meant to tell Woman's Hour. We want to know. Woman's Hour has got schedules. You and yours will have schedules. What they like to know is the security of knowing that there's certain slots that are taken in those programmes because it's been filled already for the story. There's nothing that we want less than just those stories and an hour or an hour and a half to fill. So there's a lot of competition out there. Again, thinking of the appropriate angle, your story can be covered on potentially 2 programmes with a different angle to it. And again, thinking in terms of a named person, which can be more difficult with radio in that you can't just go online and see who the producers are, but you can ring them up and find out who the producers are and what their email address is. And again, keeping it fairly short, but attaching maybe a press release to it. And this can be something that they can use to then sell on. And again, like I say, don't forget, certainly we as freelancers, you potentially, in this room now, potentially, there's a lot of work for me. People like me. And so it means money to you, it potentially means money to us too. And this is an example of an organisation up in Gateshead with a pretty savvy person who's in charge of it, a woman called Alice Waits. And she's contacted me a few times over the years with different stories. I think this was actually her very first email to me, I think. She got my name from somebody else that I had interviewed previously, a couple of years beforehand, I think. So this is how she wrote her email. It's called Knitted Lives, the idea. So she says, we've been working with a textile artist and a group of elderly ladies to make knitted objects that reflect things that have happened in their lives. The objects are going to form an exhibition at the Lyme Art Gallery in Newcastle this October. Do you think Women's Hour would be interested? So immediately she tells me what's happening. Then she gives me some examples, and we love examples and anecdotes in journalism. So there was a 94-year-old lady who knitted a communist bag because in the 1930s she had helped build barricades to stop Oswald Mosley coming through Bermondsey to get to Bethnal Green and the Jews. An ex-midwife who knitted a midwife's bag, and she had a quote there from the ex-midwife, which I think is lovely. I mean, again, it's certainly in radio, we think, oh yes, senior sister said watching the deliver was like listening to a symphony. A 75-year-old who knitted a dustbin to reflect being brought up in care, living on the streets and becoming a dustbin woman. She told us, my life felt rubbish, and I just thought that emptying rubbish was appropriate for what I was feeling. And then she said, I can give you lots more details if you think it's worth pursuing. Well, of course it was worth pursuing. I mean, the one person who didn't want to talk to me was actually the dustbin lady. But, by getting that press release, I can then pass on a shorter version of that to a producer of Women's Hour. They can say yes or no. They said yes, and so Knitted Lives got 10 minutes on Women's Hour, where I talked to the women involved and went round the exhibition at the Lyme Art Gallery and had it explained to me, and it was lovely. And then one of my producers at Women's Hour, when I was telling her about this, sent me an example of something that didn't work. She said, this is sometimes a thing that we have to put up with. It's not television. Dear Women's Hour, I'm trying to start a conversation about the problem of hemorrhoids and a revolutionary new treatment. Is this something Is this something the programme would be interested in covering? And as my colleague said, there's a headline, let's talk about hemorrhoids. She said, to which the answer is, let's talk about very quickly, I'll move on to local radio as well. Again, it's all about the same thing I'm saying, about finding out who the right person is to approach. All it needs is a telephone call. Ronan Robinson, for those of you who don't know, is a wonderful broadcaster. He's been on Radio Sheffield for a number of years, and he's really interested in the community in Sheffield and South Yorkshire and Derbyshire. And he gets people on his programme to talk about a whole range of different things. It could be politicians, it could be very tough with politicians, but it can be, people who are craftspeople. There's different slots on his programme where you could go into, and I was, not that long ago, he has a slot called My Life So Far, I think it is, and I was on that, talking about my life so far in 10 minutes. If you're interested, you've got an interesting story to tell, that could be a slot that they want to put you into. So I asked Rony what he looks for as well, how best to approach radio. Write a short paragraph sexing it up with a teasing headline. This is Rony's kind of humour, I should say. Call it a press release and put in a possible phone number and email address in. Send it again if no one notices. So if it's disappeared, and just send it in again, because that happens, doesn't it? You know, we've only got that much space for the emails, and they drop out of vision, and then you forget them. And then, as he says, very pertinently, and then get in the Yorkshire Post or the Sheffield Telegraph, and you'll get a call back straight away, because they'll realise what they've missed. And if they're interested, and again, some of you may have had this experience yourselves. You know, you'll probably get a phone call, you get an email saying, can you give me your phone number if you've not put it in already? They'll probably ring you up for a chat. It's fine if it's not convenient. You know, just say, I'll ring you back. Think about what you want to say. And, you know, if they want to continue doing an interview with you, and they say that's actually really interesting, that we'd like to do something, okay, so is this live, which on, you know, local radio quite often it is, on Roni's show it is, or will it be pre-recorded? So obviously when I went and interviewed the knitters up in Gateshead, that was all pre-recorded. And as a result of being pre-recorded, you then, as I then edit it a lot, whereas if it's live, there is no editing. They have pluses and minuses. Down the line, i.e. is it going to be on the telephone, or are you being invited into the studio? Is it going to be just you and the interviewer, or are you going to be part of a discussion? Because you can sometimes be wrong footage, you know, just because you haven't thought to ask these questions, and you think it's all going to be about you, and then you turn up and there's 2 or 3 other people there, and you realise that you've only got a tiny amount of space to speak in. So it helps to know all of that in advance. You have a perfect right to ask all these questions. Is it going to be in a proper studio, or in one of these little self-operated studios, you know, where somebody shows you into the studio, puts the headphones on, flicks the switch, and then you just have to sit there and wait for this to happen? Obviously, you want to know how long the interview will be. And, you know, the basic facts, where you're supposed to go, who's going to meet you, isn't going to meet you. Just all the basic, the nitty-gritty, really. Just so that you're well prepared. I mean, how many of you have been on radio? Okay, so that's quite a few of you. And was it, does anybody want to tell me whether it was a good or bad experience?
Oh, it's great. I do Roni's.
It
was great. I do Roni's every now and again.
Oh, Roni's?
Yeah.
Yeah? And what were you talking about?
I will talk about me, but also general stuff. It's you know, when he has 2 people in to talk about kind of current affairs and that sort of thing. Much easier than I had imagined it would be.
Yes.
But that has an awful lot to do with him.
I was going to say that a good interviewer will make you feel relaxed. I mean, there was, many years ago, there was a presenter on Radio Sheffield, and he didn't make you feel relaxed. And you know, that's really not what you want. I mean, I remember he interviewed me once, and I went in, Bush got this bank of studio equipment and everything. He didn't look up, didn't look me in the eye, carried on doing whatever he was doing. I don't even think he said hello, even when he said, like, you're on. I don't even think he said hello. That was really off-putting, and a professional reporter, professional broadcaster should not do that. They should make you feel at ease. Okay, so just a few tips for, you know, if this happens, about not taking notes in. Somebody want to tell me why not? Sorry? Because it wasn't. Because you're sitting there, you know, you're going like this, and you're completely script bound, and it's off-putting all around. So, you know, again, if you're really anxious, you put some main bullet points down on a postcard of what you want to get across. That's fine. Even in my experience, I've had people coming in and they actually want to read what they've written down. Well, that's not radio. Radio is about people talking. Obviously, you take water in, or they usually provide water, but it's a good idea to take your own in as well if you've got here, because you know it can be hands up. Say you had done radio. Did anybody find it intensely nerve-wracking?
I was singing.
Sorry?
I was singing live, and that was quite scary.
Oh, you were singing live? Yeah. Did it work out okay?
I was glad it was over. But it sounded okay, apparently.
Yeah, quite. We always think afterwards, to fret. And talking to somebody immediately beforehand, that just helps, and again, if you're a singer, you'll know this, it's just about kind of relaxing your voice a bit, so that if you're relaxing into the experience of something going on there, there's an unfamiliar environment with headphones on and a microphone pointing at you. So it's just about, they usually have a chat with you beforehand. Again, good places, good people would always have a chat with you beforehand, because it just helps you to relax. And it can be daunting. If it's any comfort, there's a fantastic reporter on Radio 4 called Hugh Sykes, who covers Iraq, Afghanistan, and all places like that. He was my coup when I did work for the British Cutlery and Silverware Association. I managed to get him to come to Sheffield, and he was absolutely delightful. He brought his little son with him, who's probably now on the towel. And he was lovely. He did something for the Today programme about the cutlery industry. But years later, I heard him on the radio, and he was being asked. He was talking about difficult situations that he'd been in, and the interviewer said, "So, what's the most difficult situation that you've ever been in?" And there was a pause, and he said, "Actually, this is the most difficult situation I've ever been in, because I'm not used to being on this side of the microphone." So you're not alone if you feel daunted by it. Just a few more questions, I'm not going over time. Answer the question, but if you think, actually, if you think it's the wrong question, then you've all heard politicians and how they dodge out of questions. So if you think it's the wrong question, just answer the question you think it should be answered. It might even help if you take in, when you take in, you do take sort of like postcard, just the question that you would ask yourself. Because again, if you're pre-recording something, I would always ask at the end of the interview, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Because sometimes, the recorder has missed something. Keeping it simple and straightforward. Making eye contact is very important, because we're only human. Using stories and examples, illustrations, we're after illustrations. And, don't think you're going to tell your whole life story and describe absolutely everything that you've been working on for the last 20 years in 3 minutes, or 10 minutes, or even half an hour. Just think what the messages that you want to get across, 3 clear points, and be happy that you've got some media airing. Unless you're really not happy, in which case you're perfectly within your rights to complain afterwards. But hopefully that won't happen. Enthusiasm. And again, just coming back to what Andy said much earlier on, that the journalist isn't out to get you, and if they are, then don't feel that you have to engage in the argument. You've come there to talk about some specific things. That's your duty to yourself, really. And, you know more about this than they do. And what I always say with journalism is that we're not experts, except in one thing, that we're experts at finding experts. And you're all the experts about what you do. So you have that over the journalist, who may well ask questions that you think are rather stupid questions. But then, as I also tell my students, there is no such thing as a stupid question. Because he who does not ask a question remains a fool. Right, okay. Oh no, don't my own name again. Yeah, just a couple of things. We all fret after we've been on radio, we all think we could have done better. Forget it, it's over, it's done with, it's not going to be on iPhone quite possibly, so you've done fantastically because you've actually been on radio. If you're happy, write and tell them, say thanks very much. You know, if it's a newspaper, a magazine, just thank them. We don't get that many thank you letters or emails. If you're not happy, and it's something that you really think you were badly served by, you can take it up. But you know, or you might just think, oh well, I'll know next time. And keep a note of the contacts, because they could be useful for further projects. So that's my email address. Okay, thank you very much.